So today I'm going to be talking about the notes on imperialism. So let's start. So imperialism is a foreign policy in which a dominant nation influences a weaker nation politically, economically, and or socially. Old imperialism took place from 1500 to 1700. It took place in the Americas, African city-states, and Indonesia, and the imperializers were France, England, Portugal, and Spain. So it was preceded by the Commercial Revolution. New imperialism was from 1850 to 1914. England, France, Germany, and Italy, and Belgium, the U.S., Russia, and Japan took part in it. It was preceded by the Industrial Revolution. Foreign expansion coincides with economic change. The Congress of Berlin, which we're going to hear more about, was when Europe decided to have a conference and negotiate who could colonize what parts of Africa. And there was no one actually from the continent, Africa, that went to this Congress. No one was invited. So it's just, yeah, we're going to talk about that later. That's later in the notes. So causes. Nationalism it caused imperialism, and that there was competition for political dominance in Europe. Each country wanted to be the hegemonic state, and they knew that more land means more power. In the military, port facilities were needed around the world to refuel modern ships. On the economic side, there was a need for new markets and raw materials. On the social side, there was a missionary movement to spread Christianity. There was also ethnocentrism and racism. The Europeans believed that they had a duty to quote-unquote civilize quote-unquote lesser people. An example of this would be Rudyard Kipling's poem, which is A White Man's Burden, which is all about how it's like the duty of a white person to civilize people from other cultures. And coincidentally, he wrote the Jungle Book as well, so that'll give you a perspective. Anyway, so social Darwinism was another cause. Europeans believed that if they didn't dominate, they risked being dominated. There was also some physical causes. There were transportation improvements, such as the steam engine, weaponry improvements, such as the Maxim gun, and medical improvements, such as the smallpox vaccine. Forms. There are many forms of imperialism. In a colony, which is what we see in old imperialism a lot, one society completely annexes another society. In a protectorate or a satellite nation or a puppet nation, the indigenous government remains but is subject to a stronger nation's influence. An example of this would be Eastern European nations during the Cold War. In a concession, a weaker society grants a stronger nation a specific economic right. Some examples are Egypt giving oil to the English companies and Hawaii giving pineapples to the Dole Fruit Company, which I think exists today still, Dole Fruit Company. Anyway, so it often leads to colonization, which we can kind of see in Hawaii, at least, now it's a state, but in a sphere of influence, a weaker society grants broad economic rights to a stronger society. An example of this is China in relationship to Germany, England, and France. So in a mandate, there is temporary control, and it's usually granted by an international organization. An example of this is when the U.S. decided to do the government for the Philippines. So, patterns of management. There are two main patterns of management in imperialism: direct control and indirect control. In direct control, it goes by the paternalistic model, where the mother country provides for your basic needs, but it doesn't give you any rights. The government is occupied by the colonials at all levels. Some examples are the Congo to Belgium, which was originally just controlled by their king, Leopold, but there are so many human rights abuses that they had to make it so that the Congo was controlled by the country itself, Belgium. Anyway, so the Congo to Belgium, Angola to Portugal, and Tanzania to Germany, and Indochina to France. In indirect control, there is rule through local government. This leads to the ability to cultivate good indigenous leaders. Some examples of this are India and Canada to England. So, in Africa, David Livingstone and Henry Stanley led imperialism. Stanley got lost in Africa, and he published his findings, and then Livingstone was the one who found him, and then they had a whole story out of it, because they met all the people there. As a result, King Leopold of Belgium colonized Congo and exploited the local people. So in the Congress of Berlin, that was held so that the Europeans could bargain over which African countries they could colonize. This began the scramble for Africa. By 1914, all of Africa except for Ethiopia and Liberia was colonized. Liberia was a state founded for ex-slaves, and Ethiopia was able to remain independent by the work of King Menelik. When the rest of Africa was divided, Europeans had no regard for traditional ethnic boundaries. South Africa. So South Africa was colonized earlier, and it was in the 1650s by the Dutch Boers. The English started to settle in 1805, forcing the Dutch to migrate north into Zulu lands over the Great Trek. The Boers created two states where they found Transvaal, orange, gold, and diamonds. The English wanted to get all of this stuff, so they tried to go into the Boers, or formerly the African lands, formerly the Zulu lands. But so then there was the Boer War, which was when the English and the Dutch fought over who could get the land that wasn't really theirs to begin with. And then the Dutch, who lived in South Africa after it became a colony of England because England won. Forgot to mention that. So those Dutch who still lived there were called Afrikaners. This colonization led to apartheid, which is a segregation of European and African races in South Africa. So this led to there were intrinsically many human rights abuses and at this time. So the white areas in South Africa were very modern and industrial, kind of just like going anywhere else around the world at the time. And whereas in the homelands, which is where the indigenous people were forced to live, it was basically like a third world country. Like there was no electricity, running water. It was completely unequal, and they were forced to stay in these homelands. And they had a policy where if you were African, you couldn't go into the white areas unless you had a job there, and that was called the pass system. So you need to have a pass in order to get in there. So post-apartheid, South Africa, had some problems. They dealt with instability due to the fall of a police state, because without the police officers governing everyone 24/7, when that kind of falls apart and you're no longer being oppressed by someone, then you kind of go a little bit overwhelmed by your freedom. I don't know, that sounded bad. Anyway, so with the fall of the police state, there's some instability, and there's poverty, which is probably there for a long time, to be honest. And then there's economic inequality and AIDS proliferation. So in the Middle East, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire until Governor Muhammad Ali broke away from Turkish rule. Ismail modernized Egypt and built the Suez Canal. Egypt sold this canal to England because of the debt, which led to colonization. So in Persia, Iran, also known as Iran, that was desired by Russia due to its access to the Indian Ocean, and it was desired by England because it was a buffer to India, which they wanted to get. Persia granted concessions to both, and they established spheres of influence. So India was once under control of the Mughal dynasty, which limited the extent of imperialism. As the Mughal dynasty declined, imperialism rose. In the 1500s, new trade routes reopened trade with China. The English East Trading Company built trading posts along the Indian coast, and the French decided to build posts to compete with the English. Just shows what England and France are like with each other. Anyway, so they built the posts, and then there was kind of some conflict over that. So Robert Clive, who represented the English, defeated both the French and the Indians using a sepoy army, and the sepoys were native Indians who supported the British army, in case you don't know, which you probably should know. Anyway, so Robert Clive beat them using a sepoy army at the Battle of Plassey, which led to colonization of India. India became the crown jewel of England due to its textiles and vast market. Home industries were eventually banned, which forced Indians to buy English goods and led to Indians moving towards a cash crop economy, which is overall pretty detrimental. World events led to a greater demand for textiles in England, kind of causing them to do that. So there was a Crimean War, which cut off supply of Russian jute, and the Civil War in the United States led to, it cut off the supply of American cotton. So the Sepoy Rebellion broke out because the native Indians were forced to, in the Sepoy army, were forced to move to places they didn't want to go, like that weren't their traditional ethnic group, to different places that they weren't used to living, that they didn't choose to move to. And also because there is a rumor going around that the English were greasing their cannons with animal fat, which was offensive to both Muslims and Hindus. So after the rebellion, England seized control of India from the East India Company. Then Ram Moham Roy, who is known as the father of modern India, called for Indians to modernize and abandon traditional culture to compete against the English. He called for an end to widow suicide, the caste system, and child marriages. After that was the Amritsar Rebellion, in which 1,200 Indians were wounded after protesting against England. After that, two nationalist groups emerged, which were the Indian National Congress, or the INC, and that kind of helped India go on to independence. You should know who Gandhi is too. I mean, that should be pretty obvious. And that he was a leader that helped with India's independence, but really, we should all know that. So then, there's also the Muslim League, which was later, and that's what helped India and Pakistan separate, because it was basically like one thing. And Muslims went to Pakistan, and Hindus stayed in India, or moved over. It was actually quite bloody, and there was a lot of conflict that happened during that time, and there is still some conflict around like the borders between it. Anyway, so Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was imperialized due to their location to China and their raw materials such as minerals, oil, coffee, pepper, cinnamon, indigo, tea, copper, cocoa, coconuts, pineapple, rubber, and bananas. Burma and Singapore were imperialized by England. Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was imperialized by France. New Guinea, Marshall Island, and Solomon Island were imperialized by Germany. Indonesia was imperialized by the Dutch. So Siam, which is now known as Thailand, remained independent due to the work of Kings Mongkut and King Chulalongkorn's effort to modernize. So let's review China now. So India's main river is the River of Sorrow, also known as the Yellow River, also known as the Hanghe River. It floods irregularly, so while providing fertile soil, it also causes death and destruction. So the Tian Shan/Himalayan mountains and the Gobi Desert/Taklamakan deserts act as a barrier to invasion from the north and the west. This allowed for China to develop without contact for many years, and it led to the indigenous name of China, which is Zonggao, no idea if I said that right, which is the Middle Kingdom. That's the English translation. So it also led to ethnocentric worldview. So Laos is the fertile soil of China. Also, due to geography, China had some overcrowding, and most of the land is not inhabitable because it's like deserts and mountains. So some common traits in most Chinese dynasties is that each dynasty will rebuild the Great Wall, readopt Confucianism, re-implement the civil service system and exams. So the Xia dynasty, XIA, was present only in Chinese folklore, and there's no written record or archaeological evidence. It's said to have been founded by Yu the Great. Then, the first official dynasty that we really know existed is the Shang Dynasty, which is the first civilization in China. It was founded around the Hanghe River. Then there was the Zhou Dynasty, which overthrew the Shang, and it introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven to justify what they did. In the mandate of heaven, the right to rule comes from above. As the dynasty declines, they become corrupt. The country is besieged by problems like crime, invasion, and natural disasters. And then a new dynasty will receive the mandate and replace the old. So that's what you think happens in the mandate of heaven. So in the Zhou Dynasty, for the first 400 years, they ruled strongly, but then feudalism developed in the last 400 years. There was strong local government and a weak central government. Taoism was widely practiced during this time. They believed that man is naturally good and will act naturally if left alone, and laws inhibit that. So the Zhou were followed by the Qin Dynasty, which was led by Shi Hongdi. During this time, Han Feizi developed legalism, saying that man is bad and we need strong government and strict rules. So the Qin built the Great Wall and the Grand Canal and common measurement system and common currency. They also persecuted the Confucianists and burned their books. The Han Dynasty was next, and it's the classical civilization of China. And at the time that is in like the golden age of China is Chinese peace, which is known as Pax Sinica. And they adapted Confucianism in the civil service exams, creating a meritocracy. So then the Song, the Shi, and the Tang dynasty were Song, Shi, and Tang dynasties were at the artistic golden age of China. They also had foot binding. So the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, well, it was Genghis Khan who led the Mongols at first, but it's Kublai Khan who started the Yuan dynasty in China. And he, even though he was a Mongol, he governed, we should know this from review, that he governed China as if he was like the original king of China. Like, he really focused on that area and not so much like overall all the places that the Mongols had conquered. Anyway, so the Yuan dynasty, that was the first time in China's history that foreigners had successfully invaded. This started Pax Mongolica and eventually assimilated to Chinese culture. So the Ming dynasty happens next, and that had China's age of exploration, which was led by Admiral Zhang Ho. I think that's how you say it, but it's spelled Zhenghe. So after his death, China turned to a policy of isolationism due to the ethnocentric belief that the Europeans had nothing worth trading for. This happened in the midst of the scientific revolution in Europe. Imperialism in China. So the Qin dynasty ruled since the 1700s. They were Manchurian. China had a self-sufficient army and strong agriculture and diverse production of natural resources and finished goods, which allowed for a favorable balance of trade. So China scorned Europeans' products and limited trade with Europe. The Opium War started because England was, so what happened is China would only accept silver from the English in order to trade. Like, they didn't want any of the other English goods. So England ran out of silver and they needed to get some money, so they smuggled in some opium, and they tried to get everyone in China addicted to it. And so they tried to get demand for the drug. And by 1835, 12 million Chinese were addicted. In response, China seized English warehouses and ships full of opium and burned them, which started the war. And I think that was totally justified. I would have done the same thing if I were them. Anyway, so the English steamships were made, the English steamships and modern cannons defeated China's navy. As a result, China signed the Treaty of Nanjing, which was an unequal treaty, and it gave England the city of Hong Kong, and it made China pay reparations, granted the English a right to extraterritoriality, which extraterritoriality is when you don't get tried by the laws of the country. If you're an American, you go over to China, well, in this situation, if you're an English person and you go over to China and you break a law, like, even if you're living in China for a long time, like, you get tried in the English courts and not the Chinese courts. So that's what extraterritoriality is. So some people say that was kind of ethnocentric because the English believed that the Chinese courts were inferior, which is why they wouldn't want to be tried in there. Anyway, so extraterritoriality, and the treaty also opened China's ports to trade. So in the Taiping Rebellion, there was massive overpopulation and corruption, which led, that was what led Hong Xiuquan to lead a peasant rebellion. 20 to 40 million people died, the government weakened, and farms were destroyed as a result of this rebellion. Other European nations recognized China's weakness and sought their own treaties, starting spheres of influence. In 1900, the Society of Harmonious Fists led the Boxer Rebellion. They were peasants who protested social inequality and foreign influence in China, and they attempted to expel Europeans. So, history of Japan. So, Japan is an archipelago of 4 main islands. It is part of the Fire Rim of the Pacific, which led to geologic activity. And as an island, is impacted by oceans, and it's close to continental Asia, which has an impact. Very little of the land is inhabitable, and there's few natural resources, which leads to the need to trade. Japan's geography led to a reverence towards nature, which is shown in Shintoism, the traditional religion of Japan. So the Yamato period, led by Prince Shotoku, started cultural exchange with China. Chinese culture blended old with the new. They adopted the mandate of heaven from China, but they said that you can't lose the mandate. And they developed Buddhism from China, Buddhism, but they added it, modified it to make it Zen Buddhism, so a different type of sect of Buddhism that they made. And they developed a Japanese writing system that was similar to the Chinese character system. After that was the Heian period, which was followed by the feudal period. During this time, there was a strict social class system. The daimyos were lords that ran the local governments. The samurai were the warrior class. The shogun was the top daimyo. The Tokugawa shogunate developed, and the emperor became a figurehead. The shogun kept a strong central government while also having a feudal economic and social system, and they had no trade with anyone except for the Dutch. So imperialism in Japan. The catalyst for change was when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor with 4 steamships and requested U.S. rights to refuel and trade in Japan. So the shogun was kind of intimidated by this, and so he signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opened 2 ports of trade and created a U.S. embassy. Other Western nations sought similar deals. Then, in the Meiji Restoration, Japan overthrew the shogun and restored the emperor and began to modernize and industrialize in order to resist imperialism. So the main cause of the restoration was social dissatisfaction. So the samurai were unhappy with the growing influence of merchants. The merchants were unhappy with their lack of political power. The peasants were unhappy because they had too many taxes and they were peasants, so happy you're going to be. And everyone was unhappy with the Treaty of Kanagawa. The goals of the restoration were to restore the emperor, expel foreigners, and modernize. The new emperor was Emperor Matsuhito. They used methods of nationalism, industrialization, militarism, and imperialism in order to restore Japan. Diplomats were sent overseas to learn a Western way of life. Their new government was a constitutional monarchy, which was modeled after Prussia. It was a bicameral legislative branch, which included a prime minister and a cabinet. A bureaucracy was created, and power became concentrated in the military. We can see that because they did all these changes, they actually Europeans didn't get extraterritoriality anymore because the Japanese courts were so similar to the ones in Europe as a result of that. So economically, modern infrastructure was built. Zaibatsu, which are like large family-owned, state-funded corporations, were made. And Japan expanded silk and tea production to trade with the West. Society improved as the feudal classes were abolished and everyone had equality under the Constitution. In an urbanized, Japan urbanized overall, and it blended old with the new. Japan turned to a foreign policy of imperialism. In the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 over Korea and the Japanese-Russo War of 1904 over Manchuria. So that's some examples of imperialism in Japan. So, the results of all this imperialism we just talked about. So, countries impacted by imperialism experienced social, political, and economic changes as modernized. Politically, Many countries experienced a weakening of its central government, which eventually would cause the fall of the ruling family that would be overthrown. Colonial boundaries formed in Africa by Europeans disregarded tribal boundaries. Another result was the partition of Indian subcontinent into Muslim and Hindu nations. On the economic side, modern infrastructure developed. During imperialization, home industries were banned, which made people dependent on the mother country. A moneyed economy was also introduced, and countries transitioned towards growing cash crops. Socially, Western ideas such as education and democracy were spread. Thousands of people died in resistance to imperialism, yet lifespans ended up increasing as health improved. That being said, there is also the introduction of new diseases to populations that weren't used to defending themselves against it, such as smallpox. Countries lost their traditional culture. A strict social class system was developed by Europeans who would oppress indigenous people. Indigenous ethnicities became the minority in many places. Massive cultural pluralism was developed, which led to ethnic conflicts of today. So I hope this helped. I know this is kind of a tough topic, but I hope I didn't say anything too offensive to anyone. But yeah, I got through it. Woohoo, you're done. Hope this helps you study.